From 1972 to 1975, President Nixon orchestrated a series of events that became known as the Watergate scandal. The scandal grew into a national embarrassment and ultimately led to Nixon's resignation. To a great extent, Nixon lived the remainder of his life under this shadow. My name is Dr. John Haas, and I'm joined by Dr. Chris Gold and Professor George Jarrett. Today we are talking about Watergate. George, when we look at President Nixon, he's known as the imperial president. What is an imperial president?
Okay, well, that term was popularized by a historian who Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was writing about Nixon, but he used the term the imperial presidency because I think he meant it wasn't just Nixon, but the office itself had become so powerful by then. It was as if the president was like an emperor, someone who could do whatever he wanted, and to a great degree, this was a product in the 20th century of the growth of the United States as a world power. And so in a lot of ways we can see a president like McKinley, who started the Spanish-American War, or Woodrow Wilson, who dragged the country into World War I, as leaders who had strengthened the office of the presidency by talking about foreign threats. And this was especially true in the Cold War. Truman and the National Security Act that was passed to build up an apparatus around the president to make important foreign policy decisions, to have a spy apparatus. You have the CIA, the NSA, and so on during this period. Really created an office where the president could make decisions without consulting Congress, without informing the people. He could act in secrecy and make enormously important decisions that affected millions of people without any kind of public oversight. And just to give one example for Nixon, setting aside everything to do with Watergate, for example, in the conduct of the Vietnam War, when he ran in '68, he promised to bring a peaceful end to the war in Vietnam, but rather what he did in his first term was to expand the war. He secretly began bombing and sent troops into Laos and Cambodia and turned a war where the U.S. was fighting in one country in Southeast Asia into a war that the U.S. was fighting in 3 countries in Southeast Asia. Was
there anything about his background, his personality, that would contribute to this idea of the imperial presidency?
Well, again, I think it's the institutional change that creates the capacity. You have a president who has so much power and power that he can wield in secret, but then you add to it a man like Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon ultimately believed in winning at any cost. And certainly after the breakdown in Watergate, people went back throughout his entire political career to the very beginning to show that he was always a master of what they called dirty tricks. He had no qualms at all about lying, cheating, making the other guy look bad. When he was running for Congress, he accused his opponent, who was a woman, of being a pink, which was, in the language of the day, someone who was secretly sympathetic.
Like Helen Gahagan Douglas?
Yes. Accused her of being secretly sympathetic to communists. So this is the sort of thing that Nixon had done all along. And in the case of what happened with Watergate is he used the power of his office to attack his political opponents. And it grows out of Vietnam.
Yeah, one thing that kind of strikes me is that really by 1962, everybody had written Richard Nixon off. I mean, he lost the presidential election in '60. He lost the gubernatorial race in 1962. And, Richard Nixon said, "You won't have me to push around anymore," to the press. But he kind of found his way back into politics. I mean, it was really a political miracle. The Democratic Party was split. The Democratic Convention in Chicago, there were a lot of people that were being clubbed and really hurt. There was a protester going on the campuses. The Vietnam War had been going, badly. There was latent racism that was used. He talked about the forgotten people, the silent majority. It really is kind of a miracle. And you kind of wonder how somebody would come up with this idea of being imperial when you barely got back in. You'd think that somebody might be a little bit more on the humble side or be a little bit more cautious than really talk about it. But I mean, he kind of sequestered himself from the rest of the world and just worked on his own foreign policy and had people kind of protecting him. So it is very interesting how he kind of rose, from this oblivion and came up. But he was very smart that way. He had a lot of political savvy to kind of get him going, on all that stuff. Of course, the one thing when you talk about Richard Nixon, you always think about the Watergate scandal. I mean, you can't talk about Richard Nixon, without that. Can you give us a little background into the Watergate scandal, what was going on there?
Richard Nixon was up for re-election in 1972, and it was clear that he would most likely win the election. He was the incumbent. Nevertheless, they collected an enormous amount of money, and an agency, the Committee to Re-elect the President, was organizing his campaign. Now, this agency, CREEP, broke into Democratic Party headquarters. And they broke into the headquarters at Watergate, and that's where the term comes from. Watergate is a complex that's still in Washington today. It has a hotel, apartments, there are offices there, and the Democrats were centering their campaign there. They were making big decisions. So they broke in with the intent of tapping the phones to listen in on the Democratic plans, and they were caught. They were caught red-handed, and they had a lot of money on them. The money was traced back to CREEP, and they begin investigations. And Nixon and the Republicans say, oh, we had nothing to do with it. These are some yahoos. We never told them to do it. It's all swept under the carpet, and it goes away. And the Democrats let it go. They let it slide away. Nixon is reelected.
I want to ask a point on this, which is kind of amazing. Couldn't have Richard Nixon at that point, when it was all going on, take responsibility and clearly say, I didn't know anything about the break-in, I fired all these people, and go on? He seemed to believe that he had mastered politics, that he enjoyed this excitement that says, you know what, yes, I got to continue on there. I mean, George, what
in the end, it wasn't just about the break-in. That was bad enough,
right.
Breaking the law. It was about the cover-up.
Yes.
Once it was clear that these men in CREEP could be traced back to the White House, it also became clear that, well, what did the White House do about it? Well, it turns out that they were paid a huge amount of bribes, $500,000 in campaign funding that was hidden. It was paid out in cash to these men not to testify to the grand jury. The Nixon people had people in the grand jury telling them what was going on. It's supposed to be completely secret. And there's just basically a mounting series of events where time after time Nixon makes the decision to go after people to try and hush things up. And every time he does that, when later it's revealed that he's done that, it makes him look even worse. So ultimately there's a three-way power struggle between the office of the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court.
Good, yeah. And as these events are being unraveled, beginning with the Washington Post and these very dogged reporters and then the Senate committee hearings, they pay hush money, but he also uses the power of the presidency. He uses the FBI and the CIA to cover this up. And it's his lying and the cover-up which is ultimately what Americans find most egregious.
I think what's very interesting about this, John Dean came up to him, when the burglars, they wanted more money for hush money, and John Dean said, Mr. President, I think they might need $1 million. And he said, John, there's nothing to worry about. I know where I can get $1 million. You kind of wonder, where's $1 million? Like in a coffee tin, or you got it in a drawer at the. Where do you come up with $1 million for the hush money? Right. And I think maybe the greatest irony here was that these eavesdropping devices were set up to capture and catch other people, which ultimately captured ensnared our president. That really came back. But George, let me ask you in a sentence or two. Watergate. What's the legacy of Watergate? Do we learn anything from Watergate? Were any changes take place because of Watergate?
Well, during the breakup of Nixon's presidency, Congress really tried to reassert its authority over, especially American foreign policy. The War Powers Act was passed, which insisted that only Congress could declare war and put a limit on what the president could do without congressional authority. This long, drawn-out series of investigations, the Church Committee hearings, revealed all these secret dealings. The United States had tried many times to assassinate Castro, for example, had been directly implicated in overthrowing governments in countries like Guatemala in the 50s and Chile in the 70s. And so there's this sense we got to put limits on it. So they passed laws like the Freedom of Information Act, so people could know about whether or not they were being spied on. They forbid the FBI from infiltrating political organizations. In the 60s, the FBI had been bugging Martin Luther King, for example. So the idea was to limit this kind of executive authority to put limits on the imperial presidency. But if we look at subsequent administrations, really those limits were broken. You know, if you look at Iran-Contra and Reagan in the 1980s, or the current controversies with George W. Bush about spying on overseas telephone calls, those are examples of where this idea of the imperial presidency is still very much alive.
Yeah, Chris, in a sentence or two, what do you see the legacy being?
From the perspective of American voters, it creates a deep disillusionment with the American government. It was really something Americans haven't gotten over. We would never trust our president or even our politicians in the same way. To a certain extent, Americans are just kind of looking for, what's he lying about now? You know, where is the scandal?
Sure.
When is it coming?
Sure.
So it creates a political malaise. People aren't so interested in these politicians who all seem to be crooks.
I think one thing, too, we never realized what a foul mouth the president had. You get all the tapes, expletive deleted. I mean, one right after
and
another.
Racial slurs as
and
well.
racial slurs and a lot of other, and 18 and a half minutes of missing tape. The Watergate scandal led to the indictment of more than 40 highly placed Nixon administration officials, including the president's closest aides and attorney general. The president himself was guilty of lies, crimes, and systematic deception. Faced with impeachment, Nixon resigned in disgrace in the summer of 1974. We'll see you next time at My History Lab.